Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7.
Glad to be diving into this one.
Yeah, so today we are unpacking a viral infographic that claims animism is the primitive trunk of the world's religion family tree. But, is it really?
Right, that's the big question.
Exactly. So we'll journey from the biased theories of 19th century colonial anthropologists who actually thought religion started as a misunderstanding of dreams, all the way to modern cognitive science that proves seeing spirits in nature is actually an evolutionary survival mechanism.
It is quite the journey.
It really is. And before we get too far into the weeds, if you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button, because we are putting a major assumption under the microscope today, and we want you along for the ride.
Yeah, it is. It's really the perfect time to pull this specific thread, because when you look at that sprawling family tree of world religions that's just bouncing around the internet, it is incredibly seductive to accept it at face value.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it looks so official.
Right. You see this massive, ancient-looking trunk at the bottom, labeled animism, and it's holding up all these intricate branches of human spirituality, so your brain just naturally assumes, so that is where it all began, right at the bottom.
It just makes intuitive sense when you see it laid out visually like that.
Exactly. But we really have to pause and interrogate the foundation of that image. Like, what actually is animism? Why did European thinkers so confidently install it as the absolute first religion?
And they were very confident about it.
Oh, extremely. And more importantly, how does viewing the natural world as a complex network of persons rather than just a warehouse of objects, how does that completely upend how we understand human history?
Because that's a huge shift in perspective.
It really is. We just have a lot of intellectual baggage to unpack here.
Well, I think the best place to start dismantling that baggage is probably the word itself. Because the definition is where the confusion is initially baked in, right?
Yeah, that's usually where the trouble starts.
Right. So if you flip open a dictionary, animism derives from the Latin word anima, which means soul, breath, or spirit. And the classic definition you'll find is the attribution of a soul to inanimate objects and natural phenomena, alongside the belief in a supernatural power that organizes and animates the material universe.
Which, is a definition that sounds perfectly clean, sterile, and academic when you read it on a page.
Yeah, clean on paper, but incredibly messy in actual application.
Definitely.
I mean, consider how the CIA World Factbook uses the term. They actually deploy animist as a hard demographic category to track populations.
Wait, like in a modern census?
Yeah, exactly. They use it as this catch-all synonym for traditional or indigenous religions in places like Burkina Faso, Burma, and Cameroon. They publish specific percentages of a country's population, just labeling them animist.
Wow, which is a huge generalization.
Right. And the underlying framing there usually pits animism as the inverse of major globally organized religions. The ones with formalized institutions, bound sacred texts, rigid doctrines, that kind of thing.
Right, right. And the tension here is that we are essentially forcing one word to do two completely different, somewhat contradictory jobs.
Oh, so.
Well, today, the term is used to describe living, breathing, complex indigenous religions practiced by millions of people who are actively navigating the modern world.
Yeah.
But at the very same time, the exact same word is being used in textbooks and, viral infographics as a label for the earliest, most fundamental building block of ancient human belief.
So it's a modern demographic and a prehistoric category all at once.
Exactly. And to untangle how a modern demographic category became synonymous with, cavemen, we have to look at the intellectual climate of the late 1800s.
Okay, let's unpack this, because we are talking about E.B. Tylor, right?
Yes, E.B. Tylor, the architect of the confusion.
Right. He was a 19th century English anthropologist, and honestly, looking at his work, he is the exact target audience for that viral infographic.
Oh, he would have loved it.
He really would have. He was the primary driver who popularized the theory that animism was the absolute bedrock, the baseline starting point of all human religion.
Yeah, and you really have to place Tylor in his era to understand his motivations here.
Because the 1800s were, a very specific time for European thought.
Exactly. European anthropologists at that time were totally fixated on uncovering the origins of human culture. But, and this is key, they were doing this through a distinctly colonialist lens.
Right. They weren't exactly unbiased observers.
Not at all. They gathered their data from indigenous cultures in Australia, Africa, Oceania, and the Americas. But they were sitting in their armchairs back in England looking at these contemporary living cultures and just designating them as the, quote, primitive peoples of the world.
So they were essentially treating millions of living human beings as if they were ancient relics frozen in amber.
Exactly. Just living fossils for them to study. And Tylor developed this highly specific two-part theory to explain the mechanics of how he thought animism was actually born.
Oh, the dream theory.
Yes. He asked his Victorian readers to do this thought experiment. He told them to imagine an ancient, primitive human experiencing a dream about a dead relative.
Okay, so put yourself in the shoes of that hypothetical ancient human. You go to sleep after a long day of foraging, and suddenly you're having this vivid, visceral conversation with a tribe member who died 3 years ago.
Right. And Tylor argued that upon waking up, this early human would simply assume the dream was literal, documentary proof that human souls survive physical death.
Because they just didn't know any better.
That was his claim, yeah. He thought they would rationalize that either the dead relative had literally traveled from the afterlife to visit them in the night, or that their own soul possessed the ability to, detach from their physical body, travel through some dreamscape, and return before morning.
That's a huge leap in logic.
It is. But Tylor explicitly wrote that the so-called savage or barbarian had simply never developed the cognitive ability to make a rigid distinction between subjective imagination and objective reality.
Wow. So in Tylor's framework, the entire foundational concept of spirits, souls, and the afterlife, all of it, was born out of just a primitive misunderstanding of human psychology.
Yep. He thought it was just a failure to realize a dream is only a dream.
And then he layered the second part of his theory on top of that, right?
Exactly.
Because once these early humans incorrectly deduced that souls existed, they began falsely assigning those souls to the inanimate objects around them.
Right. Trees, rocks, rivers.
Exactly. And he took this massive assumption and built an entire evolutionary theory of religion out of it. It honestly sounds like Tylor viewed human cultural development as a video game tech tree.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah, like you start at the base level, and you literally have to unlock the animism achievement before your society earns enough points to level up to polytheism.
That analogy maps perfectly onto his published work, actually. He literally charted an evolutionary tree of increasing cultural complexity.
It's a straight ladder upward.
Right. His model dictates that a society begins in the murky waters of animism. Then eventually, as their cognitive abilities supposedly sharpen, they graduate to polytheism.
Right, organizing those random nature spirits into a pantheon of distinct gods.
Exactly. Give them a few more centuries of development, and they evolve into monotheism. And then finally, they reach what Tylor unsurprisingly considered the absolute pinnacle of human achievement.
Let me guess. 19th century scientific rationalism.
You guessed it.
I mean, constructing a ladder where you specifically place yourself on the very top rung is a remarkably convenient way to view human history.
It was incredibly flattering to his peers, for sure. Under Tylor's model, if animistic practices showed up anywhere in modern society, they were dismissed as mere survivals of former evolutionary stages. Yeah, he viewed them the same way a biologist views a vestigial organ. Animism was the cultural equivalent of an appendix, just a leftover evolutionary quirk sticking around long after the society should have outgrown it.
And the intellectual heavyweights of the era just devoured this concept. I mean, Charles Darwin himself wrote a letter directly to Tylor. Yeah, he was praising his work and expressing profound admiration for this evolutionary model of religion because it perfectly mirrored the biological evolution theories that were dominating the zeitgeist at the time.
Right, applying that exact same biological hierarchy to human culture. What's fascinating here is that the problem, and this is where modern anthropology really steps in to dismantle the entire framework, is that cultural evolution simply does not work like biological evolution.
Right, it's not a straight line.
Not at all. Scholars of religion today have overwhelmingly discarded Tylor's model because it is steeped in ethnocentrism, and it just relies on profoundly flawed methodology.
Yeah, I mean, the scholar Russell McCutcheon highlights a glaring fundamental issue with Tylor's dream theory. It is entirely untestable.
Completely untestable.
Right. Unless someone invents a time machine, we cannot travel back to a Paleolithic campfire, shake an early human awake from a dead sleep, and interview them about their cosmological interpretation of the dream they just had.
Which, since Tylor obviously lacked a time machine, he just substituted heavy speculation, and he attempted to back up that speculation using data gathered from contemporary indigenous cultures.
But the data itself was compromised, wasn't it?
Oh, fatally compromised. He relied heavily on the written reports of European travelers. And specifically, he leaned on a comprehensive book detailing Zulu religion, which was authored by an Anglican missionary.
Wait, an Anglican missionary? Okay,
Yeah.
let's look closely at what that implies. Tylor is analyzing contemporary indigenous people from the 1800s and treating their practices as an untouched window into the minds of humans from 100,000 years ago.
Right.
Wait, so studying contemporary indigenous people is not the same as studying humans from 100,000 years ago. Tylor was basically looking at modern people experiencing a massive cultural collision and pretending he was looking at a fossil record of ancient humanity.
Exactly. That context changes everything about the data. The Anglican missionary who wrote that book was operating during a period of aggressive European colonialism and intense Christian proselytizing in South Africa.
So they weren't isolated at all.
No, the traditional African religious communities he was observing were not existing in some prehistoric vacuum. They were actively, dynamically responding to the presence of colonizers.
Which makes total sense.
In some cases, they were weaving Christian concepts into their own traditions as a form of adaptation, and in others, they were fiercely differentiating their beliefs as a form of resistance.
So the data Tylor treated as the, quote, dawn of religion was actually just a snapshot of a modern society navigating imperialism.
Yes, it is a record of 19th century religious conflict, not Paleolithic origins. If your goal is to study Paleolithic cultures, you must use Paleolithic evidence, utilizing the tools of archaeology.
Right, you can't just project backward.
No, you cannot simply point to a modern group of people, declare them primitive, and use them as a stand-in for your own ancient ancestors. Human cultures and religions are never static. They are constantly shifting and evolving.
Well, and Tylor's evolutionary tree also just collapses when you look at the broader historical record because it assumes every single culture on the planet marches up the exact same linear staircase of progress.
And the historical record shatters that assumption immediately. I mean, look at the Roman Empire.
Right.
They were an absolute powerhouse of technological and scientific advancement. They engineered aqueducts that altered landscapes. They built sprawling road networks. They mastered complex architectural physics.
But their religious framework was overwhelmingly polytheistic. And under Tylor's rigid progression, polytheism was a marker of what he termed low races who hadn't evolved yet. I mean, his own ladder contradicts the historical reality of who actually built the aqueduct.
It completely contradicts it. And you find the exact same contradiction in ancient China.
Oh, absolutely.
We're talking about a civilization that drove unbelievable technological innovation, inventing paper, the compass, gunpowder. They were undeniably advanced by any metric.
But their religious structures didn't fit the mold.
Right. Their cultural and religious structures looked nothing like the Christian monotheism that Tylor claimed was the necessary prerequisite for advanced civilization.
So he was just working backwards from his own conclusion.
Tylor was simply making an ethnocentric value judgment. He looked in the mirror, decided that his own reflection was a definition of advanced, and ranked everyone else based on how closely they resembled him.
Wow. He also built his theory on the premise that ascribing personality to objects or, viewing dreams as supernatural visions were childish, primitive mistakes that civilized people outgrow.
Right, the appendix idea.
Yeah. But anyone looking honestly at modern society knows that just isn't true. I mean, people today routinely have near-death experiences. We have vivid visions or incredibly powerful dreams, and a massive portion of the modern population absolutely views those as genuine supernatural events.
And Tylor would have waved away those modern experiences as primitive survivals, just cultural debris.
But they're not.
No. Modern scholars take a much more realistic view. They just call them human. These enchanted ways of interacting with the world never disappeared because they are a fundamental component of how the human brain processes reality.
Yeah, the scholar Bruno Latour summarized this perfectly. He pointed out that it is not amazing that there are people who still believe in animism today. What is actually amazing is that we are mad enough to think that these beliefs have disappeared in the first place.
That's a great quote.
Yeah.
And Latour's observation really forces us to confront our own modern blind spots.
It really does.
Because the academic world has largely rejected Tylor's evolutionary ladder, they no longer view animism as the ancient monolithic trunk of all religion. However, they haven't discarded the word itself.
Right, the word stuck around.
It did. But instead, the modern understanding shifts the paradigm entirely. Animism is no longer seen as one specific religion, but rather as a way of doing religion.
A way of doing religion centered entirely on relationships with the material and natural world.
Exactly. The scholar Graham Harvey provides a definition that really crystallizes this shift. He defines animism as a religion in which the world is full of persons, only some of whom are human.
Only some of whom are human. That is such a fascinating way to phrase it.
It is. Consider the profound implications of that framework. A world full of persons, only some of whom are human. In a traditional Western post-Enlightenment worldview, we draw a very severe, unyielding line across reality.
Right, a strict divide.
Yeah. Humans are granted the status of persons. Absolutely everything else is relegated to the status of an object. A centuries-old tree is just potential timber. A rushing river is merely a water resource to be managed. A mountain is nothing more than a mineral deposit waiting to be extracted.
But applying Graham Harvey's definition reveals a completely different relational dynamic, and it is playing out all over the globe right now.
Very true.
Take the native Hawaiian relationship with the volcano Mauna Kea. In a Western framework, it's just a geological formation of igneous rock. But in the Hawaiian animistic framework, Mauna Kea is viewed as an elder sibling.
An elder sibling. That changes everything about how you treat it.
Exactly. There is a deep, familial, personal relationship there, complete with obligations and respect.
And we observe similar dynamics with the Buwa people in Burkina Faso. They believe that specific individual spirits inhabit their traditional masks.
So they aren't just art pieces.
No, these aren't just symbolic pieces of carved wood. They are active participants in the community. It is a worldview where communication, reciprocity, and relationship extend far beyond the boundaries of the human species.
It transforms the natural world completely. It's like, instead of nature being a static, painted backdrop that humans walk around in, animism recognizes that the mountains, the rivers, and the forests are actually part of the cast of characters in the exact same play. You're acting alongside them, negotiating with them, rather than just standing on top of them.
Framing nature as a cast of characters is incredibly accurate. And because these are active, living practices, they frequently collide with modern political and legal systems.
Because the state doesn't always recognize that cast of characters.
Exactly. There are millions of people today who proudly self-identify as animist, and they are fighting significant legal battles over it. In countries like Indonesia and Nigeria, traditional religious communities are actively lobbying their governments for formal legal recognition as animists.
And these legal battles highlight exactly why this isn't just an abstract philosophical debate, right?
Right.
When a state refuses to recognize your religion because it doesn't look like a formal institution, there are massive real-world consequences. We are talking about communities struggling to get government ID cards, fighting for the legal recognition of their marriages, and battling to protect their ancestral land rights from developers who just view their sacred spaces as extractable resources.
The stakes are incredibly high. These communities are demanding constitutional protections. They're proving that animism isn't some primitive fossil you study under glass.
No, not at all.
These are diverse, evolving modern religions that are navigating bureaucracy, land disputes, and political representation just like any other major world religion.
So, if we completely discard Tylor's idea that animism is just a childish mistake made by our ancestors, we are left with a massive question. Why is this specific way of doing religion so incredibly ubiquitous? Why do human beings across vastly different eras and geographies possess such a strong, persistent tendency to see agency, intention, and personhood in the natural world?
That is the core question. And cognitive scientists and evolutionary anthropologists offer a fascinating explanation for this.
Okay, lay it on me.
An anthropologist named Stuart Guthrie developed a theory that explains this not as a cultural accident, but as a deeply ingrained evolutionary advantage. He calls it hyperactive agency detection.
Hyperactive agency detection. It honestly sounds like a diagnostic warning you would get on your car's dashboard.
Right.
But it is actually the core operating system of the human brain. The theory suggests we have biologically evolved to detect agency, to spot a mind, a motive, or an intention everywhere we look, even when we are looking at inanimate objects.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the mathematics of our evolutionary biology make this incredibly clear. Imagine you are an early human trying to survive in a hostile, wild environment.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
You are walking through a dense forest at twilight. The light is playing tricks on you, and suddenly you spot a large, dark shape looming in your peripheral vision. You have a fraction of a second to interpret that visual data and make a choice.
And the math of survival there comes down to a simple calculation of risk.
Exactly.
It is infinitely safer for your brain to make a false positive error, basically, to mistake a boulder for a bear.
Yes.
Because if your brain immediately assumes that dark shape is a bear with agency, intention, and an appetite, you trigger your fight-or-flight response. You sprint away, your heart rate spikes, you burn some unnecessary calories, and maybe you feel a little foolish when you look back and see it's just a rock.
Right, but you survive to see another day.
Exactly.
But consider the cost of making the opposite error, a false negative.
Oh, right. If you mistake an actual bear for a boulder...
Yeah, your brain assumes the shape lacks agency, that it's just a static object in the environment. You casually stroll right up to it, and you are immediately removed from the gene pool.
That's a brutal way to learn a lesson.
It is. Over the course of millions of years, the brutal math of evolution heavily favored and rewarded the humans whose brains were hypersensitive to detecting agents in their environment.
So it's literally hardwired into us.
Completely. Connecting this back to the broader implications of human history, it completely upends the old colonial narrative.
Yeah.
Animism is not the result of low intelligence.
Right.
It is not a failure of primitive people to distinguish their dreams from waking reality. It is a highly tuned, sophisticated evolutionary survival mechanism. It is the literal cognitive hardware that kept our ancestors alive long enough to build civilizations.
Yeah, Stuart Guthrie's research really highlights that it is a baseline human tendency to view the world as fundamentally social. Our brains are hardwired for social interaction to survive, so we simply take that incredibly successful social framework and extend it outward.
We project it.
Exactly. We cast that net beyond other humans to include the landscape, the animals, the shifting weather patterns, and the broader natural phenomena. We are biologically desperate to find intention in the world.
Because it's how we navigate reality. When the wind suddenly howls through a ravine, our brain doesn't just process it as a shift in barometric pressure, it translates it as a voice.
Yeah.
When a river unexpectedly surges and destroys a settlement, our social brain interprets it as anger or retribution. We are taking the complex social reality that binds human communities together and projecting it onto the massive, unpredictable canvas of nature in an attempt to understand and survive it.
Wow. So bringing this full circle back to that viral infographic that kicked off this whole exploration, the sprawling family tree of religion with animism serving as the solitary trunk at the bottom.
Right.
It is a visually striking image, and it obviously attempts to show how different belief systems interact and branch off over millennia.
But anyone looking at that image needs to mentally attach a massive asterisk to that trunk.
The biggest asterisk possible. Because animism is not the primitive starting line of an evolutionary race towards scientific rationalism.
No, it's not.
Applying the biological evolution of species model to the development of human religion is just a fundamentally flawed analogy. Animism is a complex, deeply human method of interacting with a living, breathing world.
Exactly.
It is powered by the exact same cognitive traits that allowed our species to survive the terrifying uncertainties of the wild. And it remains a vital lens through which millions of people today build meaning, demand political rights, and maintain reciprocal relationships with the environment around them.
Which leaves you with a deeply provocative thought to carry forward.
Oh, what's that?
Well, we know our brains are biologically hardwired with this hyperactive agency detection because it helped us survive the ancient forest, right?
Right.
But how is that ancient, deeply embedded hardware reacting to the entirely new environment we've built?
Oh, that's interesting.
Think about your own daily life. When you get furious and yell at your glitching smartphone as if it is intentionally ignoring you.
Guilty as charged.
Right. Or when you assign a gender and a name to your car. Or when you interact with an AI chatbot and get a creeping sensation that it has real feelings and motives hidden behind the text.
Oh.
Are we simply practicing a brand new, high-tech form of animism?
That is wild to think about. We took the biological software designed for the wilderness and seamlessly applied it to the microchip.
We really did.
Well, that is a perfect place to wrap up. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the hidden assumptions behind the media you consume. Keep searching for the deeper mechanisms driving human behavior, and never stop being curious about the incredibly complex world around you.